This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please remember to give us a big thumbs up, and also remember to hit that subscribe button. And all the links to our website, podcasts and social media pages can be found in the podcast description. Hello, I'm your host, Daz, and joining me once again today is historians Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging to discuss Ulysses S. Grant. In this episode, we will discuss his move east and his promotion to Commander and Chief of all Union armies. Grant will attach himself to the Army of the Potomac and in May 1864 begin a campaign called the Overland Campaign. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast, Grant's Overland Route. And welcome to the podcast, and just a reminder, this is part 4 of a series of podcasts dedicated to Ulysses S. Grant. So if you would like to watch or listen to the previous 3 episodes, a link is available in the podcast description. And joining me again to discuss Ulysses S. Grant is, of course, Dr. Nathan Provost. Welcome, Nate.
Hey.
And historian Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, good to be here, Des.
Last time we discussed Grant, he had won a victory at Chattanooga in the Western Theater of the war and was going to make his move east. Before Grant goes to Washington, D.C. for his formal promotion to General in Chief, what campaign does Grant plan out and what is its purpose, Nate?
Yeah, so Grant's really concerned with 2 different campaigns. The first one being the Red River campaign. He's only focused on this campaign in particular because he wants to use Major General Nathaniel Banks' force to go on an expedition to go and take Mobile, Alabama. However, Nathaniel Banks is very focused on taking Shreveport, Louisiana. The purpose of this whole campaign is to place the Union Army in a position to take Texas. And a lot of this also has to do with the fact that the French are intervening in Mexico, which is a whole separate issue. And so there is concern that possibly that there might be a war on the Texas border, but that's here nor there. So any success in the Trans-Mississippi Theater would be great for the Union war effort. Grant doesn't really think so. He would prefer to take Mobile, Alabama. However, Banks is actually going to lose the Battle of Mansfield. He very easily could have won it, but he attacks in piecemeal, and it becomes a disaster. He actually is defeated by Confederate General Richard Taylor, and they'll drive the Union back to the Mississippi River. And the other campaign that Grant was actually very focused on around the same time was the Meridian Campaign, where he actually wanted Sherman and Frederick Steele to actually link up in Mississippi and break up a large section of the railroads in Mississippi. However, it turns out to only be half successful, at least with Sherman's part, because Nathan Bedford Force is actually going to defeat William Smith at the Battle of Okolona.
Okay, thanks for explaining that, mate. Cheers. After Grant gets promoted to General in Chief and arrives in Washington, D.C., how does the Army of the Potomac view this Westerner, and how does he view them, Tim?
Yeah, so initially they're skeptical of him. You know, they're not very familiar with him. He was very quiet, soft-spoken. He didn't dress like many other generals. He was known for the informality of his dress. Sedgwick was initially, he said he was basically acceptably disappointed with his appearance, mainly because he was, you know, all business, not very personal, not personable isn't the right word. He wasn't flamboyant in any way. He never was throughout the war. But he was viewed as very business centric, very oriented. He'd obviously had success. There were some who obviously were, thought, oh, you've just faced easier forces out west. You basically you've never faced Bobby Lee deal. But he came having had substantial success in the West. So they're willing, as if they had a choice, right? They're willing to take a chance on him and see where he went. And, to some degree, obviously, he validated that initial faith.
Mm-hmm. And so Lincoln, what was Lincoln's thoughts on Grant, Tim?
I mean, he had faith in Grant since Shiloh, the attempts to remove him when he said, I can't spare this man, he fights. He recognized what Grant had accomplished by seizing Vicksburg. And basically, from that point, it can be argued that he was going to rise to top command sometime after Vicksburg regardless. But then Chattanooga just added to that. So it was just really a matter of time before he was brought to the top job.
Yeah.
So Lincoln had incredible faith. That being said, his most, his other most famous quote, other than "I can't spare this man, he fights," the one about, I can see it now, you'll be victorious. That comes later towards Petersburg.
Thank you for that. Yeah, cheers. Okay, so what is Grant's grand strategy for the war in 1864, Nate?
Yeah, so what's actually pretty interesting here is that Grant is actually going to do what McClellan actually had hoped to do previously back in 1861, which was to have all the armies working together as a single unit. Now, what is been claimed by previous historians is that, well, McClellan didn't have the best army generals to coordinate with one another. Well, quite frankly, neither did Grant, but yet he was still able to get them to work semi together. But really, there's going to be two main columns to his grand campaign to end the war. And one of them would be George Meade's Army of the Potomac that would actually drive through Virginia, and their objective would be Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Grant's protege and best friend, William Sherman, would actually take command of the Army of the Tennessee, and his objective would be Joe Johnston's Army of the Tennessee. Now, he will actually drive down through Georgia and eventually capture Atlanta, which is a huge turning point in the war by itself. But there were actually other aspects to Grant's grand strategy that are not as major, but still were important to at least what George Meade was trying to do in Virginia. One of them being sending Benjamin Butler up the Bermuda Hundred with the Army of the James in hopes that he could capture Richmond. There was Franz Sigel, who was supposed to actually go up the Shenandoah Valley and at least keep Confederate forces away from Robert E. Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. Now, the interesting thing about this is really not since the Napoleonic Wars did any commander successfully fight a two-front war, because that's essentially what Grant's doing here. He's basically fighting south in Georgia, in what is known as the Western Theater, and then also fighting in the Eastern Theater in Virginia. And then, of course, there's some expeditions into the Carolinas as well that come later. But this is a large territory. This is a very large swath of territory we're actually talking about. Eventually, Sterling Price will try to raid through, go on a raid through Missouri out in the Trans-Mississippi Theater in hopes of pulling Union troops away. So this is a very large area of operations. But nevertheless, Grant's going to put together these offensives to bring the war to a successful conclusion. Now, is it going to be successful? Eventually, yes. There's going to be quite a bit of adjustments, but the two main columns, the two main objectives remain the same between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Tennessee. And then I should probably also mention as well, they Grant wanted to also cut the railroad leading into Tennessee from Virginia, and he's going to order William Averill and George Crook to actually accomplish this. Um, and they'll actually be somewhat successful in this. And the reason for this is back during the after the Chattanooga campaign, Grant was very concerned with Longstreet's detached forces from the Army in Northern Virginia out in eastern Tennessee. And that's why he wanted to cut that railroad to sever that link between East and West for the Confederate forces.
Okay, thanks for that, mate. Cheers. And what was Grant's initial plan involving North Carolina, Nathan?
This one's pretty interesting, mainly because I think there's a lot of what if here, and if it could have worked or should have worked, or if they should have gone through with it, but they ultimately decide not to. But initially, Grant did not want to take this overland route through Virginia because the front lines had remained stagnant, they remained the same. So he actually wanted to do something again eerily similar to what George McClellan tried doing back in 1862, 1861, 1862. And that was this North Carolina expedition. It was actually developed by two of Grant's aides at the time. And its purpose was to have 40,000 men posted in Washington, D.C. to protect the capital, while another 60,000 would land south of Richmond and go on a raid through along the North Carolina coast. Um, and the reason for this was even though Grant's army would be in unfamiliar territory, so would Lee, because he's never fought south of Richmond at this point. So this plan, though, was sacked by Halleck and the Lincoln administration because they were so committed to this overland route. Halleck said they didn't have enough men to do it. They did. They just didn't want to. And it because it looked similar to what George McClellan tried doing, and he was the Democrat candidate in 1864, they didn't want any association or any connection with that. And also, we have to remember there's still some soldiers in the Army of the Potomac that are considered McClellanites, or they didn't want those soldiers to vote for McClellan in the upcoming election. I think it would have been interesting to see if this would have been successful or not, because Lee would have had one of two options. Either one, go and attack the force south of Richmond while that force of 40,000 goes to take Richmond, or he goes to attack Washington, D.C., which is very heavily defended, while the southern force would then go and take Richmond. So it was a lose-lose situation really for Lee in that instance, but who knows?
Wow, it's the first time I've ever heard of that plan, actually, to be honest. I've never heard of that. That's really interesting.
It's referenced in a few places.
Mm.
I know it's referenced in Brooks Simpson's account as well as Bruce Catton.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very interesting. Yeah. Learn something new every day, don't you? But there you go.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Okay, he does choose the overland route.
Yeah, so he does go on the overland
Yeah.
route. He does choose to do that.
And so how does Grant decide which way the Army of the Potomac moves, by Lee's left or right flank, Tim?
So the problem is actually one of logistics. Is he going to go via the railroads south of Culpeper heading towards Gordonsville, or is he going to basically take the route around Lee's right, keeping between Lee and the Potomac, or basically places on the rivers? So that's really what determines whether he's going to go left or right. Pretty simplistic.
Mm-hmm. And how does Grant plan out the logistics of the campaign?
Okay, so obviously the main logistical hub is Washington, D.C. All the supplies and everything's coming into D.C. and being distributed from there. So this gets into a little bit of operational art, which if you've I think I've talked about before on here, and if you know me, that's kind of my big thing is operational art. One of it is this idea of basing, and a operational art or concept of operational art is basing. There's also the notion of what would be called like flying bases. And Grant, in effect, sets these things up before they're ever a thing. You know, railroads have vulnerabilities. They can be easily targeted by cavalry. And in 1864, who do you have north operating between Grant and Washington, D.C.? You have Mosby, right? And other potential cavalry raiders that can hit those supply lines. And then you have to garrison it. Grant chooses a waterborne route. So he'll put things on, put supplies on boats. They'll move down the waterways. First one is going to be at Aquia Landing, so straight down the Potomac. And you don't need as many troops to garrison these because, you don't have to garrison the water. And the Confederates really at this stage don't have much of a navy that's going to threaten any of these major supply points until you get to the James, really. So he'll go to Aquia Landing, and then as they move further south, he'll look at Belle Plaine, like Port Royal area on the Rappahannock. Then as they get towards closer to Richmond, he'll move to White House, which had been on the Pamunkey River, which had been a Union supply base during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. And finally, as he gets later and finally in the campaign, he will adopt City Point as on the James as his final forward supply base.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's something that he uses in the Western Theatre as well, isn't it? The rivers, it's a great use of the rivers again by Grant. Okay, right. So why did Grant decide to accompany the Army of the Potomac in 1864, Nate?
Well, this actually speaks to Grant's personality as well as what he believed as an individual. But Grant could have easily said, I'm going to stay in Washington, D.C. I'm going to direct all the movements from here because I am General in Chief. I command all armies, not just a single one. And this is a very common practice today because generals are focused on connecting policy to strategy, and that's the general in chief's role. They shouldn't be diving into tactics or telling a group of soldiers to go take that hill. That's not what they're there for. But Grant decides to accompany George Meade in the Army of the Potomac. So we have to ask the question, why does he do this? Well, I think there's a couple of factors, so this is very interpretive on my part. But the first is the Army of the Potomac, between any of the Union armies, was the largest political cesspool of opportunistic officers in the Union Army. And it completely hindered the war effort for 3 years up to this point. Doesn't mean they weren't brave or that they didn't or that they were cowardly or anything of that. But the reality is that Lee was the guy they couldn't beat. And this political maneuvering of Union officers just made it 20 times worse. So Grant needs to be there to make sure that they stay focused on the single objective, which is Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. He also knew that that's where a large focus of possible voters are looking at and reading about in the newspapers. So there has to be success that comes from that army, or at the bare minimum, I'll call it advanced stalemate, which is basically what it becomes. But as long as there wasn't a defeat, they were good. Even William Sherman pointed out to Grant, he said, why are you going with them? You should come with us because we are going to get way more glory than the Army of the Potomac. And Grant says, no, he declined. And I think one of the most admirable traits about Grant is that he never takes the easier task simply because he gets more glory from it, or it makes him look better. This was a very unselfish decision on Grant's part. And by placing himself with that army, it actually is going to, even though it wasn't a part of his job description, tactically, it helps them. So again, a lot of that is interpretive, but those are the two ways that I kind of look at why Grant went with them.
And what was the thoughts on Grant joining them from Washington and in particular George Meade?
Well, initially the rapport between the two men was good. George Meade actually had a pretty uh, good feeling about bringing in Grant. There definitely was hesitancy with some soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, mainly because the last time they brought in a Westerner who was John Pope, he lost the Battle of Second Manassas, and that was a disaster. So their hope is that he's nothing like John Pope, which he isn't. But it was a lot of mixed feelings. I'd say the majority of the men felt confident with Grant coming to the east because the number one thing they all referenced was Vicksburg. They all knew about Vicksburg. And so they said over and over, we need another Vicksburg. So I think overall they were happy with it and they trusted that they would find final victory somewhere along the way.
Okay, so we get to the point where the Overland Campaign is going to start in the spring of 1864. When and how does the battle? When and how does the Battle of the Wilderness and what does it involve? Go to you first, Nate. Tell us about the Battle of the Wilderness.
Yeah. So the first thing Grant had to do was to determine where the army was actually going to cross. But they ultimately decided they'd cross at Germanna Ford and Culpeper Mine Ford. Um, Lee did not confront him at these two forts. So the army gets across uncontested. Um, and a lot of the reason for that is Lee is still working without Longstreet's First Corps because remember, he was in East Tennessee. He's on his way back to reinforce the army in Northern Virginia, and he's almost back, but not quite. So Lee knows he's working without an entire corps. So he's not going to go and confront him at these forts. Now, Grant knew about the absence of Longstreet. And when Union forces actually ran into the Confederate forces in the wilderness, which is this really thick wilderness, there's lots of foliage, it's dense, it's hard to see through. But there are some clearings in some places, like at Saunders Field, for instance. But the fighting is going to be very bloody, and we might question why Grant would want to pitch in a place like this. Well, it's because Longstreet's not there, and so it's going to be important for Grant to take advantage of his numerical superiority over Lee, which I should probably mention. Grant possessed about 124,000 men. Lee possessed 66,000 men, but that is with Longstreet's First Corps. So, Grant wants to use that to his advantage, and they'll run into the Confederates at Wilderness Tavern. Grant's actually going to bring up Getty's division from the Sedgwick Sixth Corps to repulse the Confederates from taking Wilderness Tavern and occupying the Culpeper Plank Road. So that's how the initial combatants start. And by doing that, Grant is actually going to successfully defend the roads that he'll need to move south. So that's a really important thing.
And what were some of the events that took place on May the 5th? Tim, I'll come to you, mate.
So on May 5th, The first part is you know, the armies are moving in different routes, but Warren's column is it's moving kind of in the direction of Orange, down the Plank Road, I think. Comes in contact with lead elements of Ewell's corps as they cross one of the few open fields known as Saunders Fields, Saunders Field. Just skirmishers at first, and basically Grant and Meade tell Warren to attack. Eventually he does, but by that point the Confederates are able to throw up some crude breastworks, and Warren's corps really doesn't gain much, limited penetrations. Several major units really don't have much success at all. That, you know, notorious units. The Iron Brigade makes a brief penetration, but ends up retreating in confusion for the first time during the war. Not a lot of people know that about the Iron Brigade, but they were forced to basically flee back to the, I guess it would be the north side of Saunders Field. The George Getty, I think, from 6th Corps, he basically has to, they identify that the intersection of the Orange Plank and Brock Roads has to be held. So George Getty has to rush back, and the Vermont Brigade, gets there right as the Confederates are, moving under Hill's Corps, are moving to capture that place. They engage, a couple hundred yards down the road. And today there's a pretty impressive granite monument to Vermont Brigade there. They suffer pretty heavily. And really the major combat, generally speaking, focuses on, in those general areas, a little bit in the areas in between, Hutchinson's Field or wherever. But that Plank Road, Brock Road intersection, and then Saunders Field are really the two hot points there on the 5th. Notoriously, the one thing where there really isn't much, or famously, Grant and Meade really don't employ cavalry very well. You would have thought moving through wilderness that cavalry would have played a role, but General Wilson, commander, of one of the cavalry divisions, and it's debatable whether it's just Grant, Meade, Sheridan's fault. Basically, he's down on, towards Todd's Tavern, down by, further away from the army, and isn't able to get word where the Confederates are, and ultimately has to be saved by another division of cavalry. So pretty poor showing by Union cavalry, and it really doesn't help the infantry in identifying and getting word back where the Confederates are. So yeah, that basically is it for the 5th.
Mm-hmm. Anything you wanted to add there for the 5th, Nate? Or
no, the only thing I'll add is that Burnside's 9th Corps did not show up that day. They were actually still crossing and still getting into position. So really, at this point, the Army of the Potomac is only engaging with 3 corps at most, and a lot of that's piecemeal or certain divisions that are engaging. So it's very awkward showing between both forces. They're trying to get situated into this very awful place to fight.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that leads us into the 6th of May. So explain a little bit about that, Nate, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so after realizing that, not much is taking place, Grant, of course, is notorious for his anxiety at the Battle of the Wilderness, which is a little bit out of character for him. But he actually shows up to the battle wearing a very nice uniform, and he has silk gloves. Well, on the 5th, remember, he's general in chief. He's supposed to leave all the tactical stuff to Meade. Well, he's getting reports back as to what's happening on the battlefield, and he's toying with some sticks, and his silk gloves get ruined. And basically, Grant finally throws up his hands in the air and just decides to get involved. The way he's actually going to do this is he actually comes up with a plan on the morning of May 6th. And that was planning Hancock's flank attack with the Second Corps. He was going to attack A.P. Hill's Third Corps. And the reason why he was going to do this was, again, Longstreet is still not there. Where is Longstreet? Well, it's not looking too good for the Confederates on their right flank, because Hancock will attack early that morning, and they're going to completely roll up the Confederate right flank, so bad to the point that Union soldiers come into eyeshot with the Confederate high command at one point. And when it looks like the Confederate right is actually collapsing, Longstreet arrives at the nick of time to then attack Hancock's left flank. And in Hancock's word, he was rolled up like a wet blanket. So Hancock is actually going to have to withdraw his forces. They retreat back to, I believe it's the Brock Road there. But he's going to post a defensive line. Longstreet, while he's actually trying to get his forces up and lead this counterattack, he's actually going to be accidentally shot by one of his own men. And he's going to take, I believe, a wound to his neck. He's going to fall from his horse. The Confederates are going to get a little bit disorganized, but according to Gordon Ray, much of the attack had slowed at this point. But Lee is going to personally lead this counterattack regardless of the situation. And sure enough, the Confederates will attack Hancock's Second Corps. Luckily, at this point, Hancock's men are pretty well entrenched. And for a while, there's pretty much back and forth fighting. Confederates briefly break through, but are pushed back out. And the Confederates are forced to retreat on the Union left. Over on the Union right, there's still more back and forth fighting over on Saunders Field. However, Sedgwick's Sixth Corps that was acting or protecting the extreme right flank of the Union Army was actually briefly rolled up. About a brigade and a half was rolled up by Gordon's division of Ewell's Second Corps. But due to poor coordination with Confederate officers, it really came of nothing, and they were actually able to repulse this Confederate attack. Meanwhile, Burnside actually is finally able to get up. He was supposed to work in coordination with Hancock, but was too slow to do so. Luckily, though, he will post himself in the center. He'll take a few rifle pits and make sure, basically, the Confederates don't push on Hancock's right flank. But basically, once again, more stagnant fighting. The only other thing I'd add is some fires broke out in the wilderness, and some wounded soldiers were burned alive as a really horrible part of this battle that took place. But again, at this point, both sides have suffered some pretty serious casualties.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add there, Tim, for the 6th of May?
No, I think Nate covered it pretty good.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, Nate, it's a horrendous battle, wasn't it? Horror. And from what I understand, Grant was very upset by the sounds coming from the wilderness that evening and was got very upset. Okay, so who was the victor of this battle and why? Let's go to Tim.
It all depends, I guess, on perspective. You know, tactically, really, no one gains any ground. Like, you know, if the Union axis is basically a line from Saunders Field to the Brock Road intersection, they maintain that. They advance forward and then get pushed back. The Confederates briefly penetrate that line and get pushed back. So tactically, yeah, and both sides have successes. You know, they both, you know, essentially flank each other a couple times, and I think so tactically, it's a tie. Operationally, Grant seizes the initiative at the start of the campaign, and from that point, Lee will never really have the initiative. To be honest, again, for the rest of the war, at least not for a protracted period on an operational level. Tactically, he may launch attacks, but operationally, he will never dictate the course of the campaign. And strategically, it's advancing the end of the war. So overall, I mean, that's 3 levels of war. The Union has the advantage in 2 of them. So probably a nod to Grant being the overall victor, based on that point, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think Lee's response is to this Grant coming in? Does he know much about Grant at this point? And I mean, after this battle, he does, doesn't he? But what's his thoughts on Grant? Would you say, Nate?
Well, I mean, at this point, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was either on May 8th or May 9th, supposedly he got together with some of his corps commanders, and they were talking about how badly Grant had been doing up to this point, and that he was losing all these men. But Lee was the only one that said, "Gentlemen, up to this point, what Grant has done has been good. He's done well." Lee actually thought Grant was doing well, and he even said from the get-go, if it becomes a siege, it's only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
Lee very much knew about Vicksburg, and he knew that if he got trapped or in a city, it's going to be the end. And I think one of the greatest disappointments for Lee was learning that Grant was not going back to Fredericksburg, but instead he kept advancing south to Spotsylvania Courthouse. One of the things in the past that a lot of people have pointed to when talking about these battles is casualties, which, to say they're not important, they are. But in this battle, the Union are actually going to lose roughly around 18,000, about 15% of their total army makeup. The Confederates are going to lose around 11,000 or 17% of their entire army. So Lee does lose a greater portion of his casualties in this engagement. But overall casualties, Grant is going to lose more. But one thing to really point out here is that both sides are utilizing earthworks and entrenchments. And really, there's this military doctrine. It's this 3-to-1 ratio, which basically says that if the attacker is engaged with a enemy that's entrenched, they're going to lose more men, or they at least need 3 men to attack for every one of the defenders there. So it's not going to be uncommon to see the attackers lose more men. You can look to World War One for a ton of examples of that, but even Napoleon saw similar ratios back in the War of the Sixth Coalition. But again, that's just looking at it through casualties. I think Tim's analysis is much better than the way that I just described it.
Okay, so again, as you said, for the first time, the Army of the Potomac is not going back over that river. It's going to go south. And so May 7th is, and in my eyes, is one of the turning points of the American Civil War. There's many of them, but I think that's one of the main ones. So tell us about this turning point, Tim.
So, yeah, I mean, they ultimately end up, Grant decides, okay, I'm not going back. So he is going to, on the 8th, he's got to move one way. He's already determined that he's going to take the water route for supplies. So he's got to move around Lee's right. So the next logical objective is Spotsylvania Courthouse. It's on the road to Richmond. has the advantage of being outside the wilderness. So if he gains control of it, Lee's going to have to fight him in the open on more advantageous ground for the Union. So that's his goal, to get to Spotsylvania. The lead elements, however, move a little bit slow, and before Grant ever gets there, Lee divines that's what he's going to do. They basically cut a road on the 8th that will shorten the distance for Anderson, who took over for Longstreet after his wounding. Richard Anderson takes control of 1st Corps and moves with all haste to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and he gets there first. Not really able to entrench. It's right as Warren's 5th Corps arrives. And, because Warren had been located kind of in the middle of the Union line in the wilderness, he moves to the lead. There's a brief fight en route to Spotsylvania, a cavalry engagement. But Warren gets near Spotsylvania, probably about a mile further to the north. But he begins to launch attacks at a place called Laurel Hill.
Yeah.
Yep, attacks at Laurel Hill, and that begins the Battle of Spotsylvania. But the Confederates win that race.
Mm-hmm. And what is so important about Spotsylvania at this point for both armies, Tim?
Well, it's to be honest, and to this day, there's nothing really remarkable about Spotsylvania. It kind of like other crossroads towns, it's where the roads go, right? Mm-hmm. So the Brock Road leads straight. If you're going to move south, coming out of the wilderness, you're on the Brock Road. That's the road, ultimately, the road to Richmond has to go through there. And for Lee, it's the same way. And that's the only, Grant has the other option. He can move, along the Plank Road to Fredericksburg, but they've done that before. Now you're, Burnside, Hooker, they've all been trying to get away from the Rappahannock and further into open country. So, yeah, it's going to put you closer to your supply base, but you're not going to really advance you're not going to maneuver south that way. So Brock Road is really your best bet. For Lee, it's important because for the same reason, in the sense that it blocks, it's a crossroads that, blocks Union movement. So time and again over his campaign, really, that's the place, if you want to get in front of Grant, that's the first logical place that Lee can do so.
Okay. So, Nate, I'm going to come to you now. What transpires over the first few days at Spotsylvania Courthouse? And, of course, May 9th to the 11th, compare the generalship of both Lee and Grant in this time, please.
Yeah. One quick thing I want to take note of, because I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but one of the goals for Grant, because his objective is the Army Northern Virginia, he's trying to get his army between Richmond and the Army Northern Virginia, because if he does so, then he can catch the Confederates outside their entrenchments, and they would be forced to attack the Army of Potomac with inferior numbers. So that's what Grant's trying to do and why he's doing all these movements. But to answer your question, I'll first address their generalship, and then I'll include any of the engagements that took place in this time, because there's so much fighting that goes on. It's kind of hard to cover all of it. But I'll start with Lee. He actually responds really well given the circumstances. He did benefit partially from luck, but Napoleon always said he'd rather have a lucky general than a good one. So he was lucky because he actually ordered Longstreet's First Corps to actually begin withdrawing from the wilderness, which placed their men closer to Spotsylvania. This was after the fires actually had broken out, and that's why they withdrew. And they also had the benefit of interior lines to get to Spotsylvania. And when it was reported the Union actually turning south, Lee figured it was already toward that position. There's been some regimental histories that have said, oh, well, Lee's a genius for realizing this. Well, he really only had two options to determine, either Fredericksburg or Spotsylvania. So he had a 50-50 chance of getting that right. Um, but either way, he realized Spotsylvania was going to be the next place. Um, he did, however, employ great cavalry tactics, basically forcing the Fifth Corps to deploy each time. They would skirmish with them on their way to Spotsylvania, and this greatly slowed Warren's advance to Spotsylvania. And then, of course, Lee's position at Laurel Hill was very well designed. And the Union never broke through that position after all of these different attempts that took place between really from the start on May 8th all the way from their withdraw on May 21st. But either way, they are going to hold Laurel Hill for the entirety of the battle. Um, he he did go against his better judgment, though, on May 11th, because he believed that the Union were actually going to be making another flank march on May 11th, when in all reality they were actually repositioning themselves to make an attack on May 12th. So he's going to remove his artillery from a salient that develops in his line, which is basically like this protrusion within your earthworks that is very vulnerable to an attack. Um, and Lee actually comes out to inspect this salient very early in this battle and actually questions if they should reform their lines. But Ewell tells Lee, "Oh no, I can hold it." And Lee says, "Okay, sure." Um, and it's going to lead to a total disaster for them. Um, and in fact, on May 10th, there is actually going to be a brief breakthrough by Emory Upton, who will lead a column of Union soldiers into the salient and break through it. He doesn't have the support that he needs. They'll be counterattacked and forced out. But even after this counterattack, Lee never says, "Oh, well, maybe we should change this or fix this." Um, so that was a big issue. But they do repulse the Union. Also, over on the far left, Hancock is going to make a very feeble attempt to attack on, I believe it's May 9th, as well as May 10th. There's another attack by Warren on May 10th that fails. Burnside actually has the best opportunity to go take the extreme right of the Confederate Army, but um, he's unable to exploit that because he's unsure of how many soldiers are there on the Confederate right. Again, it's that fog of war that you're unsure about. Grant says he wishes he had someone there with him to push him along. Um, as far as Grant's performance, though, it's actually very similar. His decision to consistently order assaults at Laurel Hill, I think, was very poorly considered at times. The initial ones, I think, were justified in hoping that they would break their tempo, that they would keep up the tempo. Also, he did detach cavalry on a raid towards Richmond that actually was ultimately successful. For Philip Sheridan, who was in command of the Union cavalry, he was brought from the west, had a terrible falling out with Meade over the role of cavalry, and he blocked their way on to Spotsylvania, and it caused a huge argument between the two. And in order to amend this relationship, this is my interpretation, Grant is actually going to order him on this raid because Sheridan said, "If you let me whip Jeb Stuart, I will." Grant says, "You said that? Okay, go do it." So takes the cavalry, and he actually does defeat Jeb Stuart and kills him in battle. But now the Union is actually left without enough cavalry to reconnoiter the positions at Spotsylvania. During the assaults on May 10th, Grant unfairly criticized Mott for not supporting Upton's attack, when largely it came down to poor communication. That said, Grant knew there was a weak point somewhere in the Confederate line, and just about discovered it with both the Ninth Corps as well as Emory Upton's attack. And on May 11th, he's actually going to reconnoiter that area and figure out its salient and plan this huge attack for May 12th. And it's one of the great breakthroughs of the Virginia campaign.
Okay, Nate. So tell us about the assault on May 12th and the impact of on the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, and what are the results of that attack?
Yeah, so I'll actually reference Earl Hess here, who wrote about this overland route. He actually claimed that the Army of the Potomac inflicted one of the greatest defeats on the Army of Northern Virginia on May 12th, due to the sheer number of casualties it caused. That Lee is never going to recover from those casualties. Um, and as well as the amount of terrain they actually captured in this assault. It's not going to win them the battle, but I surmise that if it was any other general leading the Army in Northern Virginia, they would have retreated if it had not been for Robert E. Lee. Um, so within the first 20, it was basically 24 hours of constant fighting between the Union and Confederates. Uh, the Second Corps and the Ninth Corps were to simultaneously attack the Confederate entrenchments, and they attacked with the entire corps, piercing the Confederate salient. The Ninth Corps is going to occupy A.P. Hill's Third Corps, now commanded by Jubal Early. Grant is going to send in Wright's Sixth Corps to support the Second Corps. And basically the salient becomes plugged up with all these men trying to kill each other. A lot of hand-to-hand fighting takes place. And it's one of the most bloody engagements of the entire war. It was very rainy. It was muddy. But the Union will capture the salient. Lee will try to personally lead a counterattack, but of course, his soldiers are like, please don't do that. We don't need you getting shot. So they actually have to get him back to the rear. So that way, they can go retake the salient, which they actually successfully take a portion of it. And there's a lot of back and forth fighting, but the Confederates cannot keep sustaining these types of casualties, and they actually have to retire, basically giving up a football field's length of ground that they originally occupied to the Union, and they had to form a more defensive line further back. So that way there wasn't a salient within their line anymore. But really all this does is just result in more stalemate between the Union and Confederate armies with huge casualties.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add as well, if people want to know how fierce the fighting was at Spotsylvania, a 22-inch oak tree was felled by mini balls. So, and the stump is in the Smithsonian Museum. You can go and see that. So, it's just mind-boggling. Anyway, okay. So neither side retreats from the field. What do Grant and Lee do between May 13th and the 19th? How do we interpret the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse? And I'll come to you first, Tim.
So after the fighting on May 12th, fighting doesn't stop. There's going to be continuous fighting along the lines. Grant isn't done trying to find an opportunity to break through there. Burnside will end up attacking another salient, Heath salient, afterwards, without much success. The Confederates will also look for opportunities. They will they'll probe, and there'll be an engagement at Harris Farm, away from which is technically to the, I guess it would be southwest of the Union flank, at that point, kind of on the what is now Courthouse Road between Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg, just out, outside the park. And for those who have been to, the Emerging Civil War Symposium, there, it's in the vicinity of where that symposium, it takes place a little bit further to the east. Couple monuments there. There will be fighting to the, try to get my directions right. I guess it would be southeast of Spotsylvania Courthouse on land that's preserved by Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. So basically, the Confederate, Grant will move that way. So ironically, by the time this battle ends, the Union right is nowhere near Laurel Hill. It's basically at the Muleshoe, further south, whereas the Union left is now way south of what we would call Courthouse Road, and the Confederate line mirrors it. So it really, combat there resembles, modern warfare more than anything that it, the more Napoleonic-esque warfare of the previous 2 years. This is continuous contact. The lines are, pretty much from the time Grant crosses the Rapidan through Appomattox Courthouse, the armies are not really entirely separated from each other. There's going to be fighting essentially every day.
Okay, Tim, do you want to add something? Nate, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think Tim covered that really well. I'll just add to, there's fighting at a place called Meyers Hill. George Meade was actually almost captured there. I think it's now open to the public. I actually am not 100% sure on that.
There's no signs showing where it is, but that's the name escaped me, but that's what I was talking about. It's kind of southeast of Spotsylvania Courthouse, on a different road. It's off of Massaponax Church Road. So one can find it, but it isn't easy to find.
Yeah. So very interesting place. The Union almost got around the flank of the Confederates, but were unable to do so. In this battle, again, the Union are actually going to lose a little bit more than 18,000 men. Confederates are actually going to lose about 13,000, and they'll actually lose this battle causes the highest proportion of Confederate casualties throughout this entire overland route. So once again, the Confederates lose a higher proportion. But either way, it's still tactically a stalemate. Operationally, I'd argue it's still a Union victory because the Union keep progressing the war effort. They actually just caused horrendous casualties against the Confederates and vice versa, but the Union still have the morale to actually at least keep being on the attack and holding the initiative. And they're going to try another flank march to another place, especially after the whole peripheral strategy falls apart around them between Benjamin Butler and Franz Sigel and all that.
Okay, thanks, mate. So where do the armies head next, and what is Grant's plan with Grant's strategy falling apart, Tim?
So once again, got to fall back on, he's basically set, shows the importance of logistics. That is the aspect of planning that is really hard to adapt. So given his decision to supply by the waterways, he's going to move around Lee's right. So he's going to try to, he's going to flank Lee and make for North Anna River. Elsewhere, he's got to, he still has a viable force out in the valley. Franz Sigel may be defeated, but his troops still exist. He's got George Crook's army in Southwest Virginia that will be moving, ultimately fight the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain will, try to get across the New River at what is now Radford, Virginia. There'll be a kind of artillery duel at a place called Central Depot, which will later change its name to Radford. But what he does is he appoints David Hunter, commander of Sigel's army, and directs Hunter to basically employ, living off the country, living off the land tactics, scorched earth, and move, via Staunton, Charlottesville, Lynchburg. This will include taking Lexington, ultimately burning VMI. That will prove a major threat to the Confederates that Lee will eventually have to respond to. He keeps Butler, even though Butler's kind of bottled up. Butler's a viable threat. Lee and the Confederates can't ignore it. So while he continues to directly press Lee, moving by Lee's right, all other Union forces are going to keep pressing where they can, with the exception of Banks, who has failed. But Sherman's still moving on Atlanta. So really nothing's changed in that regard. Yes, the periphery strategy to some degree has failed, sometimes through the ineptitude of some of the commanders, Banks and Sigel. But he can always replace the leaders, and he will do that again later.
Mm-hmm. Any closing thoughts, Nate, before we wrap up here on this episode?
No, just that this next movement to the North Anna River is, again, another small turning point, which we'll talk a lot more about next time.
Okay, cool. And so, that's where we're going to leave it this time. So, I mean, if you want a bit more of an in-depth look at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania battle, I do have 2 podcasts with Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War, so go and check those out. Links will be in the podcast description. But all that is left to say at this moment in time is thank you, Nate.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep, thanks, Des.
And cheers. Thank you for watching or listening to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. A big thanks to Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging for their contributions. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a big thumbs up and remember to hit the subscribe button. And remember, this is episode 4 of a series of podcasts dedicated to Ulysses S. Grant. And so 1, 2, and 3 are available in the podcast description. And for a more in-depth look at the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, host Daz was joined by historian and author Chris Mackowski to discuss these famous battles. And again, links to all of these episodes will also be available in the podcast description. American Civil War and UK History also has a website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. A massive shout out and thank you to Cody C. Engdahl, who performed and allowed us to use his piece of violin music, Battle Cry of Freedom. Not only is Cody a musician, but he's also an author of a series of fictional novels set during the American Civil War. You will find links to Cody's books in the show's description. Alternatively, you will find them on Amazon. All that is left to say is thank you for listening or watching to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. Cheers.